Yes, can you hear me, everyone? Good afternoon. I'm Lauren MacDonald. I'm Dean of the Library and Academic Resources and Executive Director of the Museum of Art. I want to welcome you to our first public program for the spring exhibition cycle. Okay, yes. Today we're excited to open our doors to Past Lives, a solo exhibition featuring 32 works by the artist Seonna Hong, who is here with us today. This program, Artist Talk with Seonna Hong, will provide insight into those works. Isole, A Voyage Among My Dreams, featuring works by the artist Seonna Hong, continues on view. And I encourage you after the program to visit the museum and see the works that we explore in the conversation today. Our museum is open Wednesday through Sunday, 10 to 4. Please visit the website to see additional programs and events, and I invite you to come back tomorrow evening from 5 to 7 to enjoy our opening celebration. I want to extend a warm welcome to Seonna Hong, our artist extraordinaire. Seonna's been here with us all week, actually doing the final touches on the exhibition, and it's been a pleasure to get to know you and work with you. I also want to welcome Dasha Matsurra, the director of Hashimoto Contemporary, who is here in dialogue with Seonna today. We are fortunate to have both of them with us, and I look forward to the conversation. I will invite Britt Boyer, the curator for the St. Mary's College Museum of Art, to introduce the program and our guest speakers. Thank you.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming today. We're very excited for this conversation today and to celebrate the opening of Past Lives. Past Lives brings forward many different chapters and lives recorded through Seonna Hong's paintings and her art practice. The magic embodied in Seonna's work comes through her ability to thread narrative and construct meaning across time, place, and identity. Her vibrant color palette welcomes the viewer into a dreamlike landscape that diverts from the ordinary to convey Inyang, or the faith that connects one life to another. A little bit of background about how we came to this exhibit is last spring I started teaching a course called Acquiring Arts. I had reached out to Dasha at Hashimoto Contemporary, who agreed to do a gallery visit for our students to be looking at these works. Seonna was on a residency with Dasha at the time and had the opportunity to meet our students directly. And our students were taken by Seonna and her work, and it led to a special connection through this. So in that course, the work Lunch Hour was acquired into our permanent collection. The work is now on view at the beginning of the Past Lives exhibit, and I highly recommend you take a look at the piece. But it's been a really fun journey working with an artist that speaks specifically to many of the styles, concerns, and ideas that resonated with our students. Seonna was born and raised in Southern California. She graduated with a BA in art from Cal State University Long Beach and continued to hone her craft, teaching art to children for several years. Her paintings are qualitatively narrative and often autobiographical, no doubt influenced by her time teaching and her work in TV and featured animation. In 2004, she received an Emmy Award for the Individual Achievement in Production Design for her work on My Life as a Teenage Robot. In 2006, and again last month in 2025, she was the recipient of the Joan Mitchell Foundation Grant and Residency. Her illustrated book, Animus, is in its third printing and can be accessed in our own library here on campus. Seonna continues to exhibit her work in shows and galleries worldwide and is represented by Hashimoto Contemporary. Today, Seonna will be in conversation with the director of Hashimoto Contemporary, Dasha Matsurra. Dasha is a curator, galleryist, and author based in Los Angeles. With over 18 years of experience in the commercial and nonprofit art world, she has worked extensively with emerging and mid-career artists to foster long-term success through exhibitions, publications, public art, and beyond. In her role as a director, she runs gallery locations in Los Angeles, New York, and San Francisco. Together with Paragon Books, she has authored and edited artist monographs and art focused on compendiums. Fostering community within the art world and accessibility to the arts are core tenets in Dasha's curatorial practice. Please join me in welcoming Dasha and Seonna.
Hi, everyone. Did we have to switch mics, or should we scoot a little bit closer? Seonna, scoot a little bit. Scoot. We have to project today. We have to project today.
This is natural, right?
Hi, thank you for coming. I'm really excited to chat with you about the new work, the old work that has turned into new work for this show. As Britt mentioned, you are not just a painter, you're also an animator, and I think kind of starting there is a fun place to lead of how those two things correlate together in your practice, and specifically kind of thinking about background painting.
Yeah, I have been lucky to have had a career both in the fine art world and in production for visual development in TV and feature animation. And I started out maybe 25 years ago or so, and I think that, inevitably the two disciplines, inform each other for sure. I have always had sort of a narrative thread to my work. There are little allegories or short stories within a body of work. And yeah, I feel like the illustrative quality, probably from a design standpoint, shows up. And yeah.
I mean, you've worked on a lot of things that I think a lot of people would recognize as well too, which is fun.
Yeah.
On the plane recently, I watched Wild Robot specifically so I could see your name in the credits.
Thank you.
Really for that one in particular, you were kind of thinking about backdrops a lot and kind of color, correct?
So my start in animation, I was painting backgrounds, yes. And then when I got into, and that was in TV, and things are sort of divided up a little bit differently in TV and in feature animation. And then when I made the shift into feature animation, the position that I have is called visual development artist, where I paint both backgrounds, characters, props, and then we'll do a whole scene to sort of show how all of those things interact with each other. So again, I'm painting scenes, which feels a lot like what I do with my own personal work too. But yeah, most recently I worked on the Wild Robot. A lot of things that people probably haven't seen too. But that one and Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, the first one, that was fun because we were trying new things on that one. And we're always trying new things, so I feel like I'm always getting a chance to exercise my skills. So even if it's not my personal work, I feel like I'm always, figuring out color compositions and even basic composition of design and balance and all of that stuff. And even the storytelling, so I'm exercising all of that stuff. So once I have the privilege of being in my own studio and working on my own stuff, I feel warmed up in a way already, and like I've
Exercise.
Yeah, I've stretched already, and I'm ready to get into it. So yeah,
and I feel like that's also one of the things that I really love about, and this is a crop of one of the larger paintings, that you always have a sense of narrative and movement throughout a piece that feels very akin to the animation of, you see this cinematic snippet of a story that's happening within that. So I guess if we can go to the next one. A lot of your work is really personal as well, and you've talked a lot about the paintings serving as journals as well, and how those all relate to the characters that move through these spaces. And one of the things that we've talked about a lot is these characters kind of being an almost avatar for you and your daughter, and how she's grown up. The characters have grown up as well. If you could talk a little bit about kind of the inclusion of those characters and kind of this narrative journey that's been happening over the course of many years now.
That one was more of a practical thing that I was working with my daughter growing up. My model was growing up, and so, you know, it's more looking back that I see that I've been marking time through using her as a model. But really, it was just that I thought she was so cute, and 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 I think a lot of children showed up in my work in the beginning. Again, probably a lot from my influence in animation, and then my model started growing. But yes, absolutely, my pieces are sort of my version of a journal entry, and I've always felt like I can represent things in image easier than I can with words, so apologies in advance for me trying to articulate all this stuff now. Dasha's helping me, thank you. And so I think in some ways too, a lot of my imagery has things codified too, because of things that are hard for me to talk about. So you'll see not only these figures that keep coming up and showing up, but these landscapes that represent kind of a subconscious or psyche, animals that show up as totems and they represent something different also. And I think because it's so personal, that's really the only way that I can put it out there into the world, because it feels so vulnerable to be out there in that way. But it also leaves room, I think I was talking about this yesterday, for the viewer to imprint their story onto the piece. So I feel like my job is to be authentic to myself and then leave it for the viewer to find something authentic to you. Some of the ways that I will pose a figure does have some cinema background in it. Sometimes it's not so much that you're just looking at the viewer, but you're participating in what, you're not looking at the subject, you're participating. Sometimes, actually a lot of times, I will have the figures that are turned away from you, but they're not disengaging with you. It's almost like when you watch a film, and if you're ever following a character and you see the back of their head, it's because you're meant to be feeling like you're with them there, and you're following them into a room, or you're following them down the path. And so that's what I feel like that's inviting you to do. So if you see some of those figures, it's still engaging you in that way. Or they're in conversation with each other, or they're consoling each other, they're pulling each other along. So yeah.
And I think also just kind of looking at these two particular pieces of this very specific stylized symbols that are these avatars for me, I've always interpreted them as you and Tiger Lily together in this kind of continuing journey that's happened.
Yeah.
Have you heard other viewers tell you what their narratives are before? And are there particular ones that stand out to you?
Not particular ones, but I mean this wholeheartedly. I actually really prefer other people's stories because I already know my own. I already know what it means to me. And so the fact that something so personal can reach somebody else and you can find a story in it, it just means so much to me when I get to hear somebody else's story. And then inevitably, they'll ask, and what was your story? And I don't want to say because I want it to stay what the viewer feels like it means to them and not have mine be interrupting it. So I actually really love hearing them. I don't know specific ones offhand, but there have been really beautifully profound stories that I've heard from other people who are imprinting something of their own experience on my work that I really love.
Yeah, because I think there's a really nice sort of abstraction of the landscape that happens within Seonna's work, but there's always an entry point. There's always a character, there's always an architectural feature, and all of the landscape feels like it could be many different places, and it's not a very specific place, which kind of leads into thinking about identity and being Korean American and thinking about specifically your Korean influences and especially on landscape for the a lot of the work. So you and I have talked a lot about this has been a very specific part of your practice and your paintings for a really long time, and you're visiting Korea and doing more research about Korean specific landscape painting and finding this accidental kind of kinship, or this kind of, it's become part of you without really knowing, and how you feel about those two, finding that influence first of all, and then kind of continuing that tradition in your own contemporary way.
Totally. It was completely not intentional. These ways of thinking about landscape that felt natural to me at the time. Again, I felt like, oh yeah, of course the animation influenced the flat sort of perspective. This is where I'm coming from on this. And then I discovered or rediscovered Korean traditional landscape painting and Asian landscape painting that I had seen, in my family's home or in the restaurants that we used to go to, that maybe it was sort of getting in subconsciously, but I definitely was not setting out to emulate that when I was doing my work. So finding it later felt like you said, sort of this weird destiny or this weird connection that I hadn't really been conscious of. So something with Asian landscape painting that's different than Western landscape painting is that a lot of it was that it was in contrast to Western landscape painting, where painters would go out and do like plein air paintings. They would be in their environment and paint things in, perspective and all of that, whereas a lot of Asian painters would look at a scene and sort of find the idealized version of it and do more like memory paintings. They would come back and do it as a memory. And when I read that, I remembered thinking, that's what I'm doing. Like, these are my memory paintings, or like I was talking about earlier, how I would sort of codify things. And it was always sort of more symbols of things. So it would be like a symbol, not, necessarily a realistic tree or realistic mountain, but it'd be a symbol of a mountain and what that meant to me emotionally and stuff like that.
They capture a mood rather than a specific place.
Exactly. And, there's some abstraction too that I think happens with a lot of Asian art, where there are these big blocks of washes of color, and a lot of times the people who populate those landscapes are more like grounding agents. It's just showing like, oh, this is a horizon, or this is, this is a place, this is where people live, this may be a village or something. But, when you look at that and your brain can, recognize this is a place with grounding and a sky and everything like that. But the fact that it's laid out like that, top to bottom, all the sort of dimensions are equal, is not really how it would be, if we were looking at this exact place in Korea. So I thought about that, how it relates to my work, that I sort of stack things in that same way, organize things in that same way. And even though I'm painting into something, in a weird way, I'm almost thinking of it as collage as I'm going.
Which there is a component of that in some of the works.
And then, for sure, and then I deliberately will put collage elements in it too. But just the way I organize and sort of puzzle it together, it's not layered in a way that, has anything to do with a realistic sort of landscape. But yeah, and then going back to Korea, just this last fall, after not having been there for over 40 years, was another sort of tie, and I sort of didn't realize how strong it was. And weaving together the stories of my parents and grandparents to those landscapes, and just getting more context to that, and marrying those two things was so moving to me, unexpectedly so. And so now it's become a deliberate thing that I feel like I'm embracing that side of me. So yeah, what sort of feels like I stumbled into, in a way, I'm revisiting now. in a way that is purposeful.
more purposeful. How do you feel like that connection has, or that kind of intention has changed how you're approaching the paintings?
I feel like as an artist of color and as a woman, I always felt like, well, I'm just painting. I'm not looking at a mirror while I'm painting and saying, I'm a woman. I'm a person of color, like as I'm painting. I'm just living my life and living my world. And now I feel like as I was, of course, always growing up and being aware of it, aware of my identity. And a lot of times it was in a negative way that people reminded me of who I was in not so friendly ways. And so I think I did a lot to try to blend in or get through. And now I feel like, oh no, I want to re-embrace this side of me and really show this voice in me, and that I'm Korean American. I sort of straddle two worlds, and that in and of itself is also unique because I also grew up with a lot of Korean people feeling like I wasn't Korean enough, and so yeah, it's this sort of third thing, but I feel like I'm approaching it in a different way where, again, I'm really purposefully embracing it now.
Or Britt, can we do a little switch? Can we go to slide 6 real quick? We're going to go a little out of order for a second. So I think talking about being in this third culture space of being both and other is a really great example of the hanbok pieces that you've made out of recycled material. So reusing, which is a very prevalent theme that comes up in a lot of your work that we'll talk about in a little bit. But I think thinking about this very traditional garment in these very American materials and kind of using that as an expression of this third culture space, and kind of your experience with making this very specific garment and wearing them a little bit during our install. Both of these pieces are also part of the installation that's in the exhibition as well, that are really lovely. But yeah, what was that process of making these pieces and kind of thinking through this installation specifically as this very particular third culture space?
I think that this was made in mid-height of the pandemic when there was a lot of anti-Asian violence and issues that were happening around the community. And again, I had this very different adult reaction than what I had experienced as a kid, where I just would have hid or just kind of waited it out. Whereas this time I was like, oh no, here we go. Like, I'm going to really be like, this is who I am, and I'm going to embrace it. And then of course, environmentalism being also a huge, important thing to me that hasn't always necessarily been a forefront theme in my work, but it would inform my choices on materials, just knowing that there's limited materials. I know as an artist I use a lot of materials, so I'm really trying to reconsider those things. And so with those things in mind, I thought I want to make some hanbok. And I found a pattern, but I wanted to approach it in this different way where I wanted to use recycled materials and really sort of highlight that too in its own art form. And so the hanbok, the sort of more rainbow sleevey one, is all made up of recycled clothing and scraps of material on the sleeves. The bottom half of the skirt is leftover canvas that I had in my studio. And then the one on the left, my Canadian husband calls it, like my version of a Canadian tuxedo, is all denim. And it's all made from jeans. So it's like all, the sleeves are repurposed legs. I managed to find a panel on jeans that I could actually put pockets in, like just little things I thought, oh, this will be cool. And the whole front part is in a patchwork style that is very Americana quilting, but also there's a patchwork art called pojagi in Korean, which is the art of sewing scraps of material together, mostly used to then wrap other things in. And it's meant to be like you're wrapping something in luck or good fortune when you give something to somebody. But it is the act of reusing scraps of material and stuff like that. And it's a really beautiful art form in and of itself. So that was sort of my version of pojagi too, is putting these different fabrics together, different jeans together, and then so doing my version of that.
Yeah. So I think these pieces in particular have such a really specifically perfect third culture and kind of third place for them, that it's this very traditional form utilizing materials and in this way that is very deeply Korean American for you, that I really love. Can we go back to 4, please? So these are images from your trip when you were recently there, and kind of thinking about the kinship between traditional Korean artists and yourself and contemporary Korean artists and yourself. Could you tell us a little bit about these particular images? They're cut paper, correct?
Yeah, so, and it's animation too. So this was, I was walking through a train station in Seoul, and they had this animation going across the hallway, and it just struck me. I was like, oh my gosh, again, this feeling of like, am I some reincarnated version? Or I don't know. Like, so again, you know, coming back to the theme of this show, past lives, like these mountain shapes that I have in my own work, these animals and this sort of collaging and all of these things that I feel like, what is this connection that I have with this artist who created this work, with this sort of, you know, imagery that having been born and grown up mostly in the U.S., that I wasn't really exposed to this kind of work that much, but I feel such a tie to it that I feel like it goes way deeper than the life that I've experienced so far. That's why I'm just like, okay, what DNA is coming through from like ancient versions of me or my family? I don't know, but it's in there. And even hearing that like trauma can be passed down through DNA, it's like there's stuff that just carries through with you, your family history, your history. There's something to, I feel like, not being so far away from your ties, you know?
Yeah. And I think visually and kind of in the embedded symbolism, there's a lot of kinship to this work specifically, and thinking about the landscape as this architectural space, as this kind of atmospheric mood space, rather than an accurate representation of a particular landscape as well. That I find really fascinating as well too, of just finding that accidental kinship with these other artists in that way.
Totally accidental.
So a lot of creation myth, and kind of thinking a lot about Korean different stories, and that very specific sort of folklore idea has also been another one of those accidental connections that's come up. The bears and the tigers have always been a really big part of your work.
Yeah.
And they show up in these very specific punctuation points. Can you talk a little bit about the kind of creation myth specifically that you recently came to and found?
Yeah, so again, you know, like I was mentioning before, I've used animals in my paintings a lot to symbolize moods, symbolize sort of totems, protectionist beasts, you know. And when I was in Korea on this trip, our tour guide was telling us the creation history, or sort of a creation myth story about Korea, of a bear and a tiger wanting to be human. And so they asked their god to turn them human, and the god said, if you go into this cave for 100 days with garlic and mugwort, and you last through that time, I'll make you human. And the bear and the tiger go in. The tiger is like, I'm out after a few days, but the bear sticks it out. And so the bear is rewarded by turning into a woman. So I was like, okay. And then, and again, meanwhile, while the tour guide is telling me this whole time, I'm like, she's talking to me. This is so weird. This is so crazy. And then I think the story goes that she's looking for, I think, a way to have a baby. The god ends up being like, I'll help you out. And then they have a baby, and that's meant to be the father of Korea. Is that right? I heard you saying the story earlier, too. I didn't do well in history class, so this is why I'm like, did I say that right? So, again, I just had never heard that story before, and just feeling like after all these years of having these symbols in my paintings and what they meant to me, it was crazy how much it felt connected to my work. Yeah.
And then, so we talked a little bit about environmentalism in your work through the Hong book, but also thinking about, as artists, and as galleries, we use so much material, whether that be packaging, whether that be canvases and paint, and thinking about reuse of materials as a physicality, but also environmentalism as a subject in your work, and thinking about climate change and thinking about shifting environments a lot. Can we start with your personal studio practice and talk a little bit about the paintings that have had past lives and are becoming new paintings that are part of the exhibition?
So in my studio practice, I started feeling like I wanted to be more responsible and conscientious about what materials I was using. And even for myself as an artist, like I was probably using really toxic stuff that I thought, oh, for even my own health, I need to be more responsible about this. So it started there, wanting to be more responsible for the community, for the earth. As you all know, LA just went through devastating wildfires, and so many people in our community were affected. And you see it on the news, and you see it in social media, but then when you see it happening to your friends and colleagues, and you see it happening on streets that you know, in restaurants and businesses that you've been to, it just hits you on a whole new level. So I do feel a responsibility and an urgency even more to address that. It has been a theme in my work for a long time. Some of the pieces, it's not up now, but there was a few pieces that I did after Katrina. Those were after the flood pieces. I have 2 new works here, the Atacama series, trying to bring attention to a big clothing dump that's in Chile's Atacama Desert. That's also really dangerous for the community there and for the world at large, and just trying to bring attention to overconsumerism. And then, again, the way that it just affects my practice is whether I'm reusing materials, trying to be conscientious of that, or I even started, Britt used the word reimagined instead of going back into old works. They're reimagined works, in that I have a lot of work that I make, and so I looked at pieces that in the past I would have maybe painted over completely, but then I thought, and just started a new painting on top of it. But thinking about, what makes me, that I have all of these different versions of me, and that there's still the side of me that, the 20-year-old is still a little bit in there, the 30-year-old is still a little bit in there. So I thought, I actually want to show a little bit of the the older painting in there too, and not just paint fully over it, but show the beginnings of it, or the parts that I still like. So I painted into those and brought them back up to a place that I feel like they speak to me again. because some of these pieces were like maybe like an old diary entry where I looked at it and I was like, "Ugh, that doesn't feel like me anymore. Who was that person?
That
who
was a
did
different version.
a different version of me, yeah. But there might have been, a little part that I still liked or still felt
So
familiar.
this one in particular, it's a lot of the kind of tree shapes and a lot of the geometric was kept, but also the central figures are the same. They're just reworked
Mhm.
in a way that's a little bit more your current way of painting.
Yeah.
Going back to this particular style of this more detail articulation of painting to this more symbolic stylized, like how was that process for you to go back into those characters?
A student asked yesterday why I didn't paint faces into my work, and I think I answered okay yesterday, but I thought about it a little bit more, and I realized, and I was talking to you about this yesterday too, a lot of it is that thing of me leaving room for somebody to imprint their own story on there. So part of it is that, and that's what I touched on yesterday. And part of it too is a little bit of the thing about memory, and that I'm basically doing these memory paintings. And I remembered hearing that we have a hard time, our brains have a hard time of recognizing faces nowadays and fully having that image be in our library. That's why like eyewitness testimony doesn't really work, because what we do is we actually see a face and then we go through our catalog of memory and imprint that face to that person's face. So it's actually very difficult to have eyewitness testimony in that way, because you may see somebody and be like, oh, but that person looked like my friend from high school. Like that's what you associate with. You just go back into your catalog. And so I thought, oh, okay, I'm just going to take the faces out completely, even more to sort of accentuate the idea of imprinting, and that everybody's going to imprint something from your memory catalog, basically. So
I think they become more of totems that way as
exactly.
well too, of kind of the same way that the bear and the tiger and these different landscapes represent these other symbols.
Exactly.
That they become part of that totem language
Yeah.
as well.
Yeah.
With those ones. What else did we want to talk about for these ones? So you collage a lot with the work.
Mm-hmm.
So some of them are specifically made, some of them are reused from your palettes.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about your practice of using discarded palette as part of your collage?
Yeah, so let me see if I can find some of it here. I don't know if it's, no, that one was painted into, but maybe there'll be another one.
Yeah.
So I feel like from my production experience, I'm a very methodical painter. And I used to make work where I had the drawing figured out, and then I would paint a small version, and then I would just paint the bigger version from the small version. But then when time got a little harder to come by, I had my daughter, I had to be a lot more spontaneous. And so I started looking at ways to almost fight my own proclivity for order. And so I started seeing these patterns in my palette that of just where I had mixed paint. And part of it was probably also a little procrastination of not wanting to start my painting, so I would just start peeling off little chunks of the palette that had dried. And suddenly I was like, I don't know if you've ever done that thing where you put glue on your hand and you try to peel it off in one day. So I would do that, and or I would do that with these palettes, and I was able to get full chunks of sort of paint swirls that I would have never done on purpose. And it was this spontaneous thing, but also controlled, where I could take this thing, I hadn't done it on the canvas itself, I had it as a separate thing in and of itself. I could peel it off, use it exactly in that shape, or even cut a shape out of it, sometimes little rocks, and then collage it back onto my piece. So collaging, but with my own paint blobs that I would have never made on the canvas. It just was a total mistake, and I ended up loving it. So I really like that I can include both control, some chaos, light, dark, messy, clean. I'm always trying to figure that out. So
The spontaneity
mhm.
with it. We were on the phone the other day, and behind you in your studio, you had some of these kind of tree shapes, like cut out and stuck to the wall.
Yeah.
How are you making the tree shapes in this? Are you going through with an X-Acto blade
Yep.
and sticking them like on the wall until you need them, or?
Yeah. So these tree shapes are vinyl sticker from a hardware store, and it's not the tree shape. It's like what you would line your drawers with. It's just vinyl
Contact paper.
Contact paper.
Yeah.
Thank you. And the hardware store is a treasure trove of materials for working with.
Or Britt, can we go back to the slide before this?
Oh yeah, this is a paint chip. And again, I think a lot of times I'm just finding ways to fight myself, in the sense that one of my challenges is looking at a pristine, clean canvas, a white piece of paper, and not knowing what to do with it, not wanting to mess it up. And so I found these paint chips, and they already had a beautiful colored ground on it. And the other beautiful thing about paint chips is it's already treated for wet media, so you can go right onto it with anything, paint, acrylic paint, glue, all the things that I was sticking on a tape, this vinyl sticker, which I don't think is on here. Oh, but this black shape is one of those shapes that I was talking about, as well as the orange shape are those things I was talking about that are pulled off from my palette. That, again, the gesture is there, but the exterior line is really clean. So it's kind of a little bit of both of the chaos and the control. And what was I saying about the
hardware store as a magical place to pull material from?
Yes. So the trees are that vinyl contact paper, and it's kind of great because it's already got an adhesive on the back. And I could almost, does anybody remember color forms? Mm-hmm. It was this sort of toy that you could just sort of re-stick these elements onto your tableau that you were creating. And so, again, it's this way of playing with something and in collage and testing things out. And then the black is masking tape. Sort of, it's a little bit more apparent in this one, and then I painted over it in this one. But what Dasha was talking about is that there's times where I need to, almost in my own, lack of time, sort of strategizing, almost assembly line myself. So I'll just cut out a bunch of trees, and it's kind of meditative too. And a lot of times, they don't work size-wise, or they don't work compositionally. So whichever one doesn't work, I just stick it on this wall behind me. And maybe they'll show up in a future painting.
Yeah. It's always fun to see the individual components before they become part of the composition as well. Can we go to the next one? So we talked a little bit about climate change as a theme, both as a subject and as a part of your studio practice and reuse. This idea of flood or water has become a very prevalent theme in the work that symbolizes multiple things for you, of kind of personally, larger in the world. So this is another example of reimagining a painting from the older version into the newer version that's in the exhibition specifically. What about kind of depicting water and flood is visually or conceptually compelling for you?
This one, and I'm probably going to say a lot of stuff about me personally. Again, like I was talking about, a lot of my work being very autobiographical. One of the things that I struggle with is anxiety, and that I can feel flooded. And so, again, it's sort of the symbolism of how I feel flooded. This was also in response to actual flooding in the world. But it just feels like when a lot of things are building up, I just have this, feeling of like it just kind of flooding all around me. So, it just helps me work out a lot of that anxiety to be able to have it represented in my work.
And there's something really beautiful and haunting about the flood as well, too, kind of thinking about water as this necessary but also dangerous force is really lovely in context with the paintings. And I think this one in particular, of thinking about Katrina for the original painting, and flood, and that very specific sort of environmental shift within that. And then going on to thinking about the climate environmental shift that we talked a little bit about, wildfires in Los Angeles, and is something that we just accept that we have wildfire season now, and that's something that we're all prepared for in a lot of ways, but completely unprepared for. And both of us being based in LA, going through that and watching all of that happen. This particular painting, we were talking a lot about nature versus man, and this sort of, again, that destructive but beautiful power of fire, and in context with Ed Ruscha, and looking at these kind of iconic spaces that are on fire. In this case, it's the Standard Oil and LACMA, and your very specific landscapes on fire, and thinking about those two things as they kind of come together with that. It's still a very tender thing, but how are you feeling about including those in future paintings now? Or is that something that you kind of think you want to give a little bit of a break before you go back to?
Yeah, I feel very tender about it. I'm still thinking about that. That's a good question. This painting here is called Wildfire Season, and I painted it in 2023, I think it's from. This one's not included in the show, but I did want to talk about it. And I had painted it in conversation with and response and inspired by Ed Ruscha's work, and this idea of wildness and corporations and the destructive qualities of both, and feeling like it was almost like I had the privilege of feeling like I was far enough away from it to comment on it in a way that was like, let's really try to do something about this. And now that it's happened in our community, it's like, oh, we really need to do something about this. So yeah, I just feel like the urgency has become stronger.
And I think we were talking about these Ed Ruscha paintings in particular. What other components of that do you feel like you want to include or find compelling to bring into kind of your general studio psyche?
Remind me what we were sort of touching on I know we talked a lot about this.
I think we talked a lot about taking these iconic spaces that could never possibly be on fire and visually setting them on fire, and then also thinking about these iconic places that we've watched actually burn recently.
Yeah. I think it's the reality of these spaces that are recognizable, that feel like are untouchable in some way, but it absolutely is very touchable, and vulnerable. And just sort of thinking about also back to my Atacama paintings, our responsibilities as consumers too, and how all of this ties in, and this world that we live in and the choices that we make, and that we're also living with nature, which is wild, and like you were saying, is both beautiful and destructive. So being able to both respect that and live around it in a responsible way, live in a responsible way with our consumerism and just the way that we need to live our lives in this modern day world. So,
which then segues into the Atacama paintings that we touched a little bit on before, of this very specific desert that has become this dumping ground for fast fashion and textiles. And a lot of that sort of visual language is still really akin to how you paint mountains and depict that, and then kind of transitioning this into this other climate crisis symbolism.
mm-hmm.
Can you speak a little bit about these new paintings?
Yeah, so these paintings, again, are in my memory style of reading these articles, feeling this impression of what these big giant piles of clothing are. And, when you look at a photo of it, it's pretty alarming, but it's just this giant patchwork out in the desert. And then as I'm approaching it in my voice, I think about the way that I pattern things, the way that I sort of design things, and there's a lot of that bojagi quilting sort of idea when I think about how I'm putting these pieces of clothing together in this patterned way, the way that it's the palette that I'm choosing, this limited palette, and these women who are interacting with it, going through it, lounging on it. Like, it's just sort of, they're just kind of part of this environment too, in this way that is like, oh, this is just not just how things are now, unfortunately, but yes, this is the world that we live in now, and how are we traversing through it. So,
Britt, do we still want to do questions?
Yeah.
Yeah, if anyone has questions for Seonna, we won't. You there's a little. Yeah, it's okay.
no pressure.
First, why did you have to make me cry 7 times with Wild Robot? That was amazing.
Yeah. No, I'm kidding.
Sorry, I read down a few. So, let me ask what you feel the artist's job is, and what steps do you deliberately take to accomplish that job in your process?
I think the artist's job is to communicate. And what was the second part of your question?
What steps do you take in your process to deliberately deliver on that job?
I think being open to that dialogue, like I said, from the viewer to me, where I feel like I'm having an honest, authentic conversation with myself. I'm putting it out in the world and it's really vulnerable. And I hope that if there is something in it that speaks to you, that I get to hear what it means to you. And that, yeah, I definitely think of my work as a dialogue. It's not just me. Here's me, like, it's absolutely about the dialogue going back and forth. Yeah, thank you. And also the Wild Robot, that was Peter Brown's story, so he's the one who made you cry.
Other questions?
Do you have any advice for young artists who want to make a career of making art, or anything that you wish you knew as an artist coming out of college?
I wish I knew a lot.
I got all that.
I will say that my trajectory wasn't straight. It was a lot of right turns, left turns, U-turns, It was a lot of saying yes to everything and being surprised. When I first got out of college, I was working in a gallery. I was taking commissions. I was doing pet portraits for people. I was doing freelance graphic design. And then I met my ex-husband, and he introduced me to animation. And I didn't even know that industry existed. I thought, elves did it still. And so completely fell into it. And it's such a huge part of me and part of my life now, and I've had an almost 30-year career in it. So I feel like being open and just saying yes to a lot of things. I know so many artists who I would say every artist that I know, their career is completely different from the next. So I have friends who are also art educators, and then they also show in galleries. I have friends who have a full print business and also show. People who are ceramicists and also teach. It's kind of everything, and nobody has the same career.
And there are many paths to success.
Yes.
Is also a very big one, and kind of figuring out what your path is such a big part of it, of being a commercial artist, being a gallery artist, being a combination of those things. There are a lot of different options other than just the one sort of, I think oftentimes is the become a blue chip auctionable artist is one of many, many paths that you don't necessarily have to follow. And participate in your community. Show up for your friends, go to openings, go to events, and engage meaningfully with your community, because that is going to be your strongest asset no matter what.
That's great, yeah.
Hi, yeah, this might be like a little bit far out of left field compared to what you're talking about. But something I've been thinking about, and like specifically the Super Bowl halftime show, where I saw political messages coming through what's supposed to be entertainment, has got me thinking a lot about like what necessarily is the difference between art and entertainment. And I was wondering, as someone who, at least to my understanding, has worked both on art for the sake of itself and art for the sake of entertainment, like what do you think the difference is?
That's a good question. I feel like specifically when I'm working for a studio, I'm a hired hand, and so I'm lucky when I align with the messages. It's tricky because there's a lot of voices in that room, not only for the project, but for maybe sometimes even the studio themselves. As far as I go, a lot of my themes about what has become important to me and issues that have become important to me didn't always show up in my work. They showed up kind of later. I know some artists who that's the bulk of what their message is. I know some artists who fully do just art for art's sake. And I think that there's many ways that they participate in their community or their activism, whether it's in their art or just outside of it. So again, I feel like it's up to the individual what that role is and where they participate and in what sort of area of their life that it shows up. Yeah.
Thank you. Hi. I know you touched on it earlier about like kind of the happy accidents between your art and how it connected a lot to your Korean heritage. I just wanted to ask specifically, in what ways does your art allow you to participate in Korean American history?
You get to help make it.
Yeah, this sort of in-between culture, like, Dasha was saying, this third culture. I almost, in a way, when I took my daughter to Korea for the first time, was able to experience that with her. Sometimes for my friends and community, I'm the access point, where I'm like, just so you know, if you take me to a Korean restaurant, I'm not going to be able to order very well. So don't rely on me. But, I'm still like able to take them to the best restaurant that I know of, or, whatever it is that I can be that access point in that way. In a lot of ways, like I mentioned, I've come to my own embracing of my culture and who I am in different points of my life to different degrees. sometimes out of a way of protecting myself and like a survival mechanism, to being a mom and wanting my daughter to be proud of that part of her. And so somehow that brought that out of me too, to total accidents where I feel the kinship of like, it's not, intentional at the outset, but once I see it, then it confirms that tie for me. Like, oh yeah, okay, that's why I was doing it. Cool. Thank you.
Since you talked about how you worked in a lot of like films and animation, I'm just curious because I've seen the Into the Spider-Verse movie like a million times. I love it. I'm just curious how much of your like own artistic expression were you allowed to like apply, I guess, to that? Because I'm sure like directors and other people like probably wanted control. I'm just wondering like to what extent were you allowed to express your own artistic, like, personal things in films like that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. Depending on the project, there have been certain shows where I'm one of 2 or 3 painters, and you're trying to, when you're watching a show or a movie, you want it to look cohesive, right? So you don't want to be like, oh, there's a Seonna painting, there's a Tasha painting. So a successful painting is one that looks like it belongs with the rest of the project. That being said, on smaller projects, I have been able to spot like, oh, there's a Jenny painting, or there, and you see the little personalities in a work, and it's really cool to be able to see that. But the objective mostly is to be able to have, whether it's 2 or 3 artists or thousands of artists looking like they're making the same thing, So a lot of times you're coming in, and what I like about animation and why I like it as a precursor sometimes to my own work is a lot of it is problem solving. And so if I get launched on a painting, yes, I'm trying to make it look pretty, but I'm also trying to make sure that the audience is looking at the right part of the scene, and it's making choices of paint, color, light to do that. So it's very technical too at the same time. And then once you have that figured out, then if I'm doing like a city scene, for example, I just have to make sure it matches the city that my colleague painted, and not, color for color, but that it looks like the same city,
The same world.
The same world. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So you mentioned a lot about like being exposed to negativity in regards to your heritage and your like Korean American identity growing up. How was the process of like, I guess, accepting that within yourself, but especially through like the creation of your art? Like, did you, I don't know, when you started making art, did you feel like it was immediately something like, I don't know, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
Okay.
I don't, like I've mentioned already, I think it was an accidental connection that I made a little later in life. Some of my work obviously looks like me because I'm painting me, and so a lot of the figures look like little Asian girls, in these paintings. But, I'm on the inside looking out, so like I was saying, I'm not constantly aware of that. And I feel like my evolution as an artist and including that and embracing that really was in lockstep with my embracing of that in myself just in life. And it wasn't a conscious decision. And again, I think that's why even more it feels like this weird destiny fate thing, because it just landed there without me trying. And like a lot of things in my life, it makes sense looking back. But I don't think I could have plotted out my life, or to your question earlier about like different life for career trajectory stuff, it makes sense looking back, but looking forward, I would have never been able to plot that out. And so same thing with art making. It makes sense now after I make the work, but I don't sit down and think this is what I'm going to do.
I think there's a lot of trusting yourself in it as well too, and trusting your own instinct with it.
Yeah.
And letting that lead you.
Yeah. And I think that what is on my mind is inevitably coming out. So especially my trip to Korea, I was so inspired by so many things. And again, getting that confirmation about a lot of things. Then I really dove into a lot of that imagery, revisiting some of my work. And even in the Atacama pieces, really leaning into that Hojagi patterning and yeah.
I was wondering a little bit, because I feel like a lot of the paintings and works I've seen from you are incorporating kind of elements of realism, and they're based in reality, but they're also kind of mythical too, like in the creation story you're talking about, but just also in like the visuals that I'm seeing. And I was wondering if when you're making these, that's something that's like consciously at the forefront of your mind, and if it is, like how do you go about walking that line so that you're kind of creating a piece that people can project on, like you were saying, but also is based in reality in a way that like really grounds it, if that makes sense.
I think I understand what you're asking. Again, I think that I have kind of abstract ideas that start off very abstract. That's why a lot of my paintings just start off as color fields or big giant shapes of things, and it just doesn't start taking shape until I start putting the figures in, or those grounding elements of like, oh, here's a horizon, this is the ground, but it's this. I think I mentioned this when we chatted yesterday, work on multiple paintings at the same time. And so I have this way of kind of cycling through, and so I have time to figure out like, oh, it's not this linear thing. I'm kind of working through emotions, and as I keep cycling through, it gets tighter and tighter of what I'm trying to say or what it means to me, and then it gets represented and then becomes a little bit more grounded in that way. But the start of it's very abstract, even conceptually, and then all the marks are very abstract too, and then it all kind of comes together at the very end.
I think you also create a lot of your own sort of folklore and mythology with the
absolutely.
work, and there is this very specific world that you have built.
Yeah.
That all of these paintings from many years apart still exist in.
Yeah. I think what I like about
the Sonniverse.
The Sonniverse. Something that I was remarking to Britt when I got to see the show up was how I could see each body of work talking to each other too. So I'm used to seeing a show with other paintings from that show, but then seeing shows from, and I was joking with Britt, like, oh, that I was really going through something because that palette is very muted, or this body of work has a lot of really dark, aggressive marks in it, and I was going through something there too. But that body of work looks different from the one that I did 2 years prior, even though there's things that have come through and that are consistent. But it's only through seeing them with each other that I even was like, oh, wow, okay, 2018 was a year, 2020 was a year, like there were different palette, whether you see it in the palette, whether you see it in the mark making or the subject matter, or how much symbology I'm using or whatever it is, I'm able to see those bodies talking even to each other in that way. So again, sort of that thing where I don't think I would have set out to say, this is what I'm going to do for this body of work, this is what I'm going to do for this body of work. But now that they're in this way that they're displayed, they are in relation to each other. So it's been really interesting to see it that way too. And like Dasha was saying, a lot of the themes that do carry through, but they're very distinct too at the same time.